Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Gifford Hartman. I'm one of the online tutors with this course. As you all know, the course is called Regulating Global Supply Chains to Empower Workers. And today, from around the world, I'm from California where it's morning, some of you it's afternoon, some of it's evening. So welcome to all of you. I just want to make a quick announcement. This is being recorded, so I want to make sure that everyone is okay with that. Okay, and some of you were here yesterday and the day before, so welcome back. Okay, just some really simple guidelines, so while Sebastian Herreros is our guest, he's the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. He's going to speak to the video lecture he gave about how important is regional trade integration for development. And we'll begin shortly, but I just want to remind you that while he's speaking, if you could stay on mute, and we'll do 2 sessions of questions. I'll begin with a question. He'll give a brief response. When he's finished, we'll open the floor for questions. So if you do have a question, either put it in chat, use the raise hand function, or we're a small group, so you could even possibly just physically raise your hand if you're on camera, and we'll go to discussions and answers. We'll do that for perhaps 20 minutes. We'll go to a second question, same format. Sebastian will give a response. We'll open the floor for questions. And at the end, if we have some time, we'll finish with a more open discussion. So I'd like to begin by beginning with my first question. And my first question is related to the video lecture and some of the responses in the exercises. And so in the video lecture, being that Sebastian is based in Latin America, he talks about the overdependency on certain commodities exported to more advanced developed countries. And someone in the comments mentioned that that happens in places like the Philippines, where there's a high dependence on some export of other commodities like nickel, gold, and rare earth minerals. And this puts the economy, makes it subject to price volatility. And but it's not only the problem of low prices. Sometimes even high prices cause what we've called the Dutch disease, where it's the inflation of local currencies, and it just causes other problems. And it just becomes a trap, this dependency on certain commodities without diversifying the economy. So my first question is, it's a trap. These economies get locked into this dependency on these certain commodities. So my question is, are there any positive examples of certain countries breaking out of that kind of pattern and being able to truly diversify and do forms of sustainable development?
Well, good morning, everybody. And first of all, thanks to Edlita and Gifford for putting this session together. It's quite an honor to be here with you today. I fully agree with what everything Gifford said about the downsides of commodity over dependence. I mean, and I found it especially interesting the point that the problem with commodity over dependence is not just when prices are low, but actually also when prices are high, because it ends up, when prices are high, your commodity, your currency appreciates, and all the incentives go towards the commodity sector and away from other sectors which are struggling to survive. So the times, I mean, when prices are low, well, you have problems in the sense that the value of exports falls, fiscal revenue falls, economic growth falls, social spending falls, and all the like, which is, by the way, something we have been experiencing in Latin America since for the last 6 years. I mean, right after the super cycle, commodity super cycle ended in about 2013, 2014, I mean, the growth rate in our region fell dramatically. I mean, the correlation is striking. I mean, the moment commodity prices began to fall, I mean, economic growth almost collapsed, and social indicators deteriorated very markedly. and the like. But the problem is also even though it is less obvious, it is also there in times of high prices because of the Dutch disease phenomenon, which ends up locking you up, entrenching you further in commodity overdependence. So it's a self-feeding loop, so to speak. Now, if you do nothing about it, I mean, that's the dynamic that sort of dynamic will continue forever. So you need intervention, you need public policies to break that vicious cycle. And I would argue that policy intervention has two sides. One which is internal, which is industrial policy. I mean, you have to, so to speak, change relative prices so that when all commodities, when all market incentives go towards commodity dependence, you need to provide some incentives to other sectors which have some promising potential through subsidies, through tax deductions, through investment in research and development and the like, to try and break the dependence with commodities. That's one thing, and that's one thing that you do at the national level. You invest more in research and development. You provide some targeted subsidies to promising activities in manufacturers or services and the like. But the second side, which is very important and which was the focus of my video lecture, is regional integration. You are not, in most cases and in most countries, you are not going to be able to break away from the pattern of commodity overdependence if you don't have a large enough market where your emerging companies in manufacturing and services where they can sell their stuff. I mean, let me provide my own country, Chile, as an example, even though Chile is not such a small economy, but it's an 18 million market, 18 million people market. For many industries, it is simply not large enough to justify the high initial investments. So that's why it is so important for Chilean entrepreneurs and Chilean SMEs, small and medium enterprises, which intend to internationalize, to know that, okay, they can rely on the Chilean market, but they can also rely on access to the markets of Bolivia, Argentina, Paraguay, Peru, even Brazil, because then the situation becomes, how could I put it, profitable, even though if they were targeting just the Chilean market, it would not be. So that's why I think regional integration is so important. Now, and actually, if you look at developed countries around the world, I mean, there's not a single, I would say there's not a single case of a country that has been able to develop without engaging in some sort of regional integration project with its neighboring countries. Now, going to specific examples, which was the main part of the question. I mean, the most obvious examples in the last, let's say, in the post-war period, of countries that have been able to do this productive jump, I mean, a structural transformation of their economies, are in Asia, starting with, well, of course, the four Asian dragons or tigers, I mean, Taiwan, Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore. And I mean, people tend to forget that these countries were once developing countries and actually very poor countries. Korea was much poorer than Chile, much poorer than many Central American countries back in 1950 or even 1960. Those were very poor countries, but they were able to reinvent themselves. I mean, moving away from dependence either on commodities or very simple, non-complex manufacturers like clothing and the like, by doing the two things that I have said here. Well, they did many other things, I mean, like investing massively in education and the like, but they were not shy about using industrial policy, first thing, and they were not, and they sought to integrate with their neighbors in East Asia, and of course also looked at relevant markets elsewhere in Europe and the United States, but they still paid close attention to their own neighborhood. That has been the same. The same goes, of course, for China. I mean, with all the very specific characteristics of the Chinese economy, they were quite aggressive in conducting industrial policies, in attracting FDI, but then saying to the foreign investors, okay, you can set up shop here in China, but you have to share your knowledge with local partners, and you have to buy local production and the like. And China integrated with the rest of what is now known as the Factory Asia. I mean, with Japan, with Korea, with Hong Kong, with Southeast Asia. And I would argue that Southeast Asia is quite a good example of countries that have been able to catch up in recent years, mostly, or in large part, not necessarily mostly, but in large part because they have been able to enter these industrial value chains with more advanced economies like China, Japan, Korea, etc. Of course, I mean, I know the question came from Indonesia, and no, from the Philippines. And of course, I mean, the ASEAN countries, the countries of Southeast Asia are very diverse. Some are very advanced, like Singapore, Malaysia. Some are, let's say, middle tier, like Thailand. Some are poorer, like the Philippines or Indonesia or Vietnam. And some are even poorer, like Cambodia, Myanmar, and Laos. Well, in the Philippines probably has not been as able to find a niche in regional value chains as Malaysia or Thailand has been. And I guess that has a lot to do with some particularities of the Philippine economy, with which I am not particularly familiar. But my point is, the Philippines has the chance to diversify its economy and to move progressively towards a more sophisticated, a more inclusive economy by linking up with regional value chains in East Asia and Southeast Asia, just like Malaysia did, just like Thailand has done, like Vietnam is increasingly doing. So the chance is there. And I think that is moving. I will leave it here. But my point is, I mean, it's been a very long and probably not very coherent response, is that there are examples of countries that have been able to jump up the ladder, the development ladder, by linking up through trade, FDI, and production with their neighbors. Most of the cases are in Asia. It remains as an outstanding challenge for the most part in Latin America and Africa. But I hope this is going to begin to change in the coming years. But I will leave it at that.
Well, good. Thank you. I think those are good examples to answer the question of where it's taken place, especially historically in East Asia. Do we have any questions? Ian, could you,
yes.
Ian first, and then perhaps Susan.
I think Susanna was first.
Okay, Suzanne, why don't you go first? And then Ian.
Thank you. Thank you for the positive examples after the two lectures we had yesterday and the day before, which were a bit I found a bit depressing. So thank you very much. Do you have an explanation why the countries in East Asia were quite successful or are working on their success, and other countries or in other areas they struggle or they seem to lose whenever they make some international contracts concerning the trade?
That's an excellent question, and I will not pretend that I know the answer. I mean, I and my colleagues have been, and many people have been thinking very hard about this for years, and I sometimes get the sense that perhaps there are some other than strictly economic factors. I mean, there might be some sociological underlying factors as well. I mean, but turning back to more economic side, I guess that commodity dependence is not so marked in the case of Asia as a whole, or even East Asia, as it is in the case of Latin America and Africa. I mean, let me be more precise. I don't think commodity dependence is so evident in the case of East Asia as it is in Africa and South America. Mexico and Central America, and particularly Mexico, is a different animal in the sense that it's definitely not as commodity dependent as the South American countries. But in the case of South America, I mean, the natural resource endowment is very plentiful, so to speak, and that's the sort of trading relationship that has been going on, I mean, for centuries. I mean, not under colonial rule since the 16th century. I mean, and the same goes, I think, for Africa. When you look at East Asia, on the contrary, of course, you have some countries which are which have this very plentiful endowment of natural resources. Some of them in Southeast Asia, in particular. But you have others like, I mean, Japan or Taiwan, or Singapore, etc., which are quite poor when it comes to natural resources. So I think there is some element which is very difficult to fight against, which has to do with what nature gave you, so to speak. I mean, when you have such an abundant endowment of natural resources, coupled with social structures, and here where sociology and history enters into play, coupled with social structures in which a minority of the population owns most of those resources, I mean, the incentives are for keeping the status quo. I mean, the dominant socioeconomic elites who own or manage the natural resource wealth of the countries, I mean, they are doing well exporting those natural resources to Europe, to the United States, to China, increasingly, getting good money out of it. And well, if that is not good for the overall development of the country, I mean, that's not their concern. So I guess, and I'm not saying anything probably that you haven't heard before, but that's probably why people talk about the natural resource curse. I mean, they put it as a curse, which to me is a very depressing argument, because it's very sort of deterministic, in the sense that, okay, there's nothing you can do. I mean, you have so many natural resources that things will not change because the incentives are so strong for the continuation of the status quo. The status quo being exporting natural resources without any value addition. I don't think history is so linear. So I think, I mean, there is space to break with that path dependency, so to speak. But of course, it's much more difficult. I mean, the political economy of breaking up with that sort of pattern is much more difficult when you have that very plentiful endowment of natural resources than when you don't, which is the case of many Asian countries. So that would be the best explanation I can offer. I mean, so in a nutshell, I mean, commodity overdependence tends to feed on itself. I mean, it's a self-feeding loop, as I said before, and it's quite difficult to break with it. I mean, it's not impossible, but it's quite difficult because of very strong incentives to continue with that along that path. Whereas in the case of many Asian countries, I mean, they were not commodity rich to start with. So they had to think, okay, what else can I export? What else can I produce? And they had to invest instead on science and technology, education, and the like. And well, you know where they are now, and where we, the commodity exporters, are. I mean, but then again, I don't think there is anything deterministic here. I'm just saying, of course, the political economy is much more complex.
Okay, great.
Breaking with this.
Okay, and I think Everline from Africa, I think he's from Zimbabwe, agrees in the chat saying that these policies are skewed to favor the elites. So,
right.
Yeah, in Africa, case two, you making your case. Ian, could you go ahead with your question?
Hi, good morning. I'm from Antigua and Barbuda in the Caribbean. What interregional development approach would you recommend for small island states in the Caribbean where, although we have a very robust movement in terms of labor, we have challenges in terms of economies of scale, weak interregional transportation, as well as a heavily dependent colonial trading patterns?
You are absolutely right. All that is very well documented by ECLAC, by the institution where I work, and probably people from other parts of the world might not be aware how different the conditions of the Caribbean are from those of the rest of Latin America, in the sense that the Caribbean countries are very small in size, in surface, but they are also very small in terms of population and in terms of the size of their economies. There are countries with, correct me if I'm wrong, but there are countries with 150,000 inhabitants. I mean,
yes,
like a neighborhood of a medium-sized city in many countries. So there is a key problem there of scale. I mean, there are many economic activities which are simply not feasible or not economically feasible for such small markets. And of course, most of the Caribbean economies are islands. So there's the problem of connectivity. And there are other problems as well. I mean, they are very prone to natural disasters and hurricanes and the like. So they face a completely, in many ways, they face a completely different set of challenges than those Latin American or South American countries face. What I could say, I mean, of course, one obvious thing to do, and which the Caribbean countries have been trying to do, I don't know how successfully, but at least they are trying to do, is achieve scale through regional integration and pooling resources and establishing common institutions. I mean, because in many cases, it will not make sense for every Caribbean country, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, St. Kitts and Nevis, to have their own, let's say, universities or health regulatory agencies or competition authorities or the like, but rather try to go for Caribbean-wide institutions. I mean, and to try and go for a Caribbean-wide market with free circulation for goods, for people, for services, and the like. I think that is a very important part of the question, but probably will not be enough. But because even if you add up all the Caribbean economies, still the overall size is not very large. So it's a region which is bound to have to integrate with, of course, the United States, and there's a very, very long trading relationship with the United States. But I would argue also with the rest of Latin America, and that is something that hasn't happened much so far. And I think the blame is on both sides. The fact is, I mean, in South America, probably the Caribbean is seen as something very remote, I mean, culturally, in terms of language. And I guess the same goes in the Caribbean. I mean, but it would make obvious sense for the Caribbean countries to link themselves more with the relatively large Latin American economies which are nearby, like Mexico, like Colombia, like, well, Venezuela, probably not in the current juncture, but otherwise, in normal times, Venezuela would be a very obvious trading and investment partner for the Caribbean economies. And that is something we should, I mean, continue working on, and so far not much has happened. But I would leave it at that, because I mean the Caribbean is a complex. I mean the problems faced by the Caribbean are particularly complex because of course there is commodity over dependence, and in some cases one country depends on one commodity or two at most. So over commodity dependence is even more extreme in many Caribbean countries. But on top of that, you have the other problems which are not present in South America or Mexico or even in Central America, like the very small scale of the Caribbean economies. And I think against that background, regional integration is the way to go. I mean, to achieve scale through integration among Caribbean countries and with the rest of Latin America. I would leave it at that.
Okay,
Thank
great.
you.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to Luis. Luis, you have a question, and then following Luis Sarvaswar, I'll allow him to go next after Luis.
Okay, thank you, Sebastian. I have two questions. I'm from Peru, and the last semester I was teaching about international trade and labor rights, and something that we realized in class is the Indian community of nations, this regional integration group.
Yes.
That, for example, Peru export more than 90% of the exportation is about raw materials, minerals mainly. But in the Indian community, we export at least 60% of products with add value, with
yes.
But also we were talking like that trade or regional integration is not just trade, but also social integration of the nations. So for example, in this space, in the Indian community of nations, there is a Indian labor citizenship that in theory sounds really wonderful because it's just to create a free mobility of workers in that region. But in practice, none of those countries have actually laws that allow them to make a difference. If a worker from Chile moved to Peru, there is not extra benefit. There is not a social. So what could be your approach in order to make this trade regional integration compatible with a social integration also? That's my first question. And my second is more about the political trends in South America, because when countries have to choose between bilateral trade agreements or regional integration, at the end of the day, this is a political decision. And as you know, now in Latin America, there are some left-wing countries and there are some right-wings, and there is some. So what is your perspective about that? Not some specialists say that we are going back to the left, or maybe we start in the middle. I don't know what is your approach about that in relation with regional integration. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Luis, and both are very good questions. On the first, I would say, I mean, the trade integration is less politically. The starting point should be trade integration is less politically contentious than labor market integration. I mean, people are more willing to let foreign merchandise enter their markets than let foreign workers enter their markets, because the perceived disruption is much higher when you have a massive inflow of people from other countries entering your job market and fighting for jobs with your own nationals. And that is something that is not a Latin American peculiarity. It is something that you observe in all countries across the world. I mean, US consumers are happy to consume Mexican goods, but they are very worried about getting Mexican or Central American workers in the job market. And the same goes even in Europe. I mean, where you have the most advanced regional integration experiment in the world, which is the European Union, where you are supposed to have free movement of labor and free establishment. I mean, a person from France can go and settle in well, I was going to say the UK, not the UK any longer, but someone from France can settle in Germany, and someone from Poland can settle in Portugal as if they were locals. Even there, you see that, I mean, it doesn't necessarily work as smoothly as you could think. I mean, part of the reason why the UK ended up leaving the European Union had to do with the perception that they were being flooded with people from other EU member states, in this case, mostly people from Central and Eastern Europe, that were competing unfairly, quote unquote, with the locals in the job market. So, I mean, I don't have a specific recommendation to make other than note the fact that, of course, integrating goods markets, integrating services markets is less politically challenging than integrating labor markets. I mean, and probably to integrate labor markets, you cannot do it. I would say that cannot come very early on in the integration process. For labor market integration to work more or less smoothly, you need countries to have relatively similar development levels. Because otherwise, when you have, let's say, I would put it an extreme example, when you have an integration agreement between a very rich country and a very poor country, the natural thing to do would be for people to flow, to try to emigrate from the very poor country to the very rich country. And we have seen this dynamic in many parts of the world. And then there's a pushback in the receiving country against what is perceived as massive illegal migration and the like. So my sense is that a completely integrated job market is probably one of the most challenging parts of regional integration. I'm not saying it should not be tried, but I'm simply noting the obvious, that it's very challenging, and probably you need to do several other things before you can think about free labor, free cross-border labor mobility. And And if development levels are very different within a regional group, I mean, migration, labor migration is bound to be very contentious. So I think definitely go for it, but let's not be naive. You cannot go for it very early on in the process. I mean, the European Union did not, as far as I know, start with labor, cross-border labor mobility in the very early years, or even in the very early decades. They went for liberalizing trade, liberalizing investment, liberalizing everything else. And at some point, when the whole experiment was more mature, they freed up the movement of workers. So I'm afraid that that's what it is. There is a certain sequence you have to respect. On your second question about politics in Latin America, my guess is probably the most, there's a paradox, because people presidents and in South America and Latin America in general love to speak about regional integration, but their deeds do not follow their words. I mean, everybody pays lip service to regional integration, but then when it comes to actually doing what needs to be done, people tend to prioritize their own national concerns. And that is a very recurring pattern, and that is a recurring pattern which is crosses across the political spectrum. It's not a left-wing thing, it's not a right wing. And I guess that's one of the main reasons why regional integration in Latin America has not gone as far as it has in other regions. Because, for instance, in Asia, let's say ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian nations. I mean, you have 10 countries which are so diverse in so many respects, including in their politics. Actually, the differences in national politics among ASEAN countries it goes from countries being nominally one-party regimes, communist regimes, to something else, other very liberal, and all variations in between. And still they manage to do business and think pragmatically and not, I mean, they define a vision for the coming 20, 30 years, and they go there. And if they have to deviate along the way to accommodate some national problems, they do, but without losing sight of the overall goal. Whereas in Latin America, regional integration goes in fits and starts. I mean, it's eternal stop-go cycle. I mean, okay, now we're launching the new community of Latin American countries and the like, nice picture, and then couple of, with all the presidents, and then a couple of years later on, the thing has achieved nothing. And since it hasn't achieved nothing, people do not think about fixing it, but rather, okay, let's create a new grouping and set things in a different direction. And so it's very difficult to make any progress when I mean, regional integration, which by definition is a very long-term undertaking, is held hostage by the short-term political cycle within every country. So it's very sad that when a right-wing government comes to a particular country, then that president will say, okay, I will brush aside the regional groupings in which my country participated before I came into office, and now I'm going to be friends with these other countries and form these new blocs and leave the previous one. And then comes the left-wing president 4 years afterwards, let's say, and then it's back to square one. And so it's very difficult to make any meaningful progress when things are changing, depending on the cycle of elections in every country. I would leave it at that because I don't want to go into the particulars of any country, but it's a very distressing feature of of Latin America, which somehow Asian countries seem to have been able to avoid.
Okay, thank you. I want to acknowledge that Philip has his hand up, as does Cheng Li, but I also don't want to forget that my second question addresses the African Continental Free Trade Area, which is an attempt that's begun.
Right.
And so maybe with keeping that in mind, we'll call on Philip. Philip, do you have a question? And hopefully we can.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, well, we can.
Yes.
Sure. Okay. I'm just a community activist. Anyway, my question is, okay, here in South Africa, we have, a relationship with South Africa, China, Brazil. It's called BRICS. And then if you look at these other countries, India as well, and if you look at all these countries, they're more, when it comes to, they're more industrialized than South Africa. And as a result, you find obviously, when it comes to trade relationship, South Africa is not benefiting anything. Instead, South Africa is always getting goods from these countries. And then because of this trade relationship, these goods at the end of the day, they do have impact on the workers in South Africa. You end up having workers losing a lot of jobs. For an example, here in Cape Town, we have a textile industry which has completely disappeared, and then because of the clothes that is coming from China, and then again, the people who are buying those goods from China, they are workers because they don't have money. It's cheaper because workers in China are more oppressed than workers in South Africa. And then again, as you have said, the relationship between workers in South Africa and workers in South Africa, they don't like workers in China. And then but they don't again mind their goods and so on. With the chickens coming from Brazil, because the climate there is favorable, and then they are able to export their import their chicken or export to South Africa, and then now and so on. So yeah, I don't know what is South Africa? Why are we in this relationship? Why? What are we benefiting as ordinary people in South Africa in this BRICS relationship? Thank you.
Well, I'm not sure it's for me to answer that. I'm not familiar with the particular reasons the South African government had to join the BRICS when it did. My sense is that the BRICS is essentially about geopolitics, so to speak. It's a sort of embodiment of the rise of the global South, and of course it needed to have one or two big guys from Asia, which are the obvious ones, China and India, and then one big guy from representative or champion from Africa, which obviously was more or less obviously was South Africa, and then one big representative of Latin America, which happened to be Brazil, because it's a larger, the most populous country and the largest economy. So the BRICS, don't forget that the BRICS was a term coined, but not in any developing country, but by a Goldman Sachs executive many years ago to again embody the rise of the global South. But there's very little that joins and then you have Russia, of course. But there's very little that joins those countries, other than belonging to the BRICS. They are very different. Well, starting with the fact that they belong to very separate and distant regions of the world. They have very different political regimes. They have very different economic structures. They compete with each other in many respects. So, I mean, I wouldn't put many hopes on BRICS membership. In fact, BRICS doesn't mean any particular type of, as far as I know, any type of particular economic integration. I mean, being part of the BRICS doesn't mean that South Africa is more open to China, India, or Brazil than it is to other countries in the world. It's again, it's sort of a label or a geopolitical thing, but then again, I wouldn't put South Africa's development hopes on BRICS membership. Far from it. Starting, among other things, because of what the reasons you yourself mentioned. I mean, you in South Africa are probably being flooded with Chinese manufacturers, same as we are here in South America, and you think you are being flooded as well with Brazilian agricultural products, and to a point where you think, I mean, that is not reasonable or manageable. So my sense is that for South Africa, the way to go should be the integration with the rest of the continent. And that leads me to the African Continental Free Trade Area, where I know there was a question about it, and we can continue talking about it. But BRICS, then again, it's a label. It doesn't come with any real economic integration among these countries. It's just a way of saying, okay, look, we are the big guys from the global south, but there's little else behind that facade, in my view.
Okay, and I do want to acknowledge that Everline actually talked about, referring back to Luis's question about that you answered with labor mobility about East Africa, but I'd also like to call on Cheng Li with a question.
Yes, very good morning, and I'm very sorry, Gifford. I'm sorry, maybe you don't have time for the second question, but I think it's very interesting debate here. That's why I somehow like to put here as well. My question, thanks, Professor. I have a question. Actually, I was thinking when you were talking about the regional, when we compare with region, I mean, the country per se is already complex. So, and talking about region many times, it's have so much particularities. So it's quite difficult to see that. But I do think there's sometimes when we're talking about the regional differences, there's a little different distribution of the work, let's say, like among the world. If without East Asians, or let's say without the initial or whatever, how it comes with more like industrialized like distribution of work in concentrate pretty much in Asia and Africa and Latin America, because I live in Brazil as well. And to say actually maybe there's some kind of like colonial shadow. So the region has the distribution of work of the internationally somehow due to the colonial, it's somehow pretty much dependent on this raw materials and many things of the raw material exporting. So in these cases, do we see this kind of big picture or big logic at the behind? And also another thing, I'm also like related to Philip as well. Although I totally agree with you, BRICS, it's rather than a labeling, rather than it's something more actually more referring to free trade between the South-South countries. Actually, if we're really looking at the trade agreements between South-South in many parts, actually it's less strict than the North and South agreements, invest agreements or trade agreements. So in many terms, actually, the South corporations are actually somehow have a little bit of space for the development or for the development of the region. So yeah, apart from Philip was talking about BRICS, but I was also want if you could give us a little bit of the reflections on this kind of free trade agreements between the South-South, and if we see any kind of potentials in that kind of situations. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. I'm quite in favor of South-South trade agreements. for the reason, essentially for the reason you yourself mentioned, that North-South agreements, then again, we're talking here in very broad categories, and reality is always more complex than what we get when we talk about broad categories. So let me say that at the outset. But broadly speaking, North-South agreements tend to be less advantageous for developing countries than South-South agreements, at least well, then again, it's more complex. Let's take an average Latin American country. Let's say Peru. And an FTA with the United States, of course, on the plus side, you get guaranteed preferential access to the largest consumption market in the world, which is likely to remain so for at least some 10 more years or so. Anyway, an extremely large and dynamic consumption market. Is that a benefit? Yes, it is. It's a great benefit, but it has its drawbacks as well. What are those drawbacks? That, okay, in exchange for granting you access to its enormous consumption market, the United States negotiators will come to you and say, okay, you have to dramatically increase the protection of intellectual property rights in your country to take it to a level comparable to that of the United States. And you will have to offer a large number of guarantees to foreign investors, some of which you would not naturally offer if you were not forced to do it. And even more so, those guarantees that you are going to have to offer to US foreign investors are going to be backed by the investor-state dispute settlement. So if in the future a US mining company thinks that the Peruvian government is not is affecting its market access conditions because, let's say, it has imposed a fine on that company for polluting a river, a nearby river, then that firm can go and take the Peruvian state to an ad hoc international tribunal and probably get a very big compensation. I think that is very problematic from many points of view. But those are the sort of clauses that you have to agree to if you are going to be part of a North-South agreement. So there is a bargain there in which you get market access benefits, but you lose policy space on the other hand. Of course, it's up to every country to weigh those gains and benefits and see and decide whether to sign the agreement or not. But I'm just noting that typically North-South agreements make force is a very exaggeration, but impose new obligations on developing countries which reduce their policy space to conduct industrial policies, technological policies, even environmental policies or public health policies. Because there are some things that after the agreement you cannot do anymore because the agreement forbids you from doing it. Imposing performance requirements on foreign investors, or freely issuing compulsory licenses for some medicines, which are important for the health of a population. All of that becomes open to question under one of these North-South agreements. Then again, there are benefits as well in terms of access to important markets, but those benefits have to be weighed against the loss of policy space. Whereas in the case of South-South agreements, those agreements tend to be much less stringent in terms of affecting your policy space. South-South agreements normally will not impose a very high level of protection of intellectual property rights, because all the agreements, but all the countries participating in the agreement share a relatively common development level, and all of them are mindful that they are not at a development stage where they need a very strict intellectual property regime. So no one is going to be pushing for that. And probably no one is going to be pushing for overly ambitious protections for foreign investment. I mean, there's going to be more awareness of the need to keep to retain policy space. And that's one thing you see, for instance, in the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, which is this big, enormous trade agreement that was concluded last year between China, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and the 10 countries of ASEAN. Even though there are some North countries there, I mean, like Japan, and it has so many developing countries in there that if you look at what the provisions of the agreement, you see that it has a lot of flexibility to accommodate the particular needs and circumstances of the poorer countries, let's say the Vietnams or of the Philippines, or in that case. So in that sense, the RCEP is much more akin to a South-South agreement, even though, of course, there are developed countries in there. Whereas when you look at a strictly North-South agreement, let's say USMCA, the new NAFTA, the new agreement between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, it imposes much tighter obligations on Mexico in terms of foreign treatment of foreign investment, in terms of protection of intellectual property rights, in terms of the ability to have state-owned enterprises and the like, because there it's the United States which is saying, okay, you want access to my market? Sure, but it comes with all these conditions attached. Take it or leave it. So that's why I tend to have a more favorable view of South-South agreements than of North-South agreements, even though I recognize that sometimes North-South agreements will give you a big benefit in terms of access to those very big North markets. I'm not sure whether I have addressed your question, but I have tried my best.
And unfortunately, we're out of time, and I want to thank you for your very well-detailed answers. So I think we're going to have to wrap up here, but it's been a really lively discussion, and I want to thank you, Sebastian Herreros, for joining us and contributing, and thank you everyone for participating. And to remind those of you who have been taking the course that Friday is the last workshop on Chapter 2 about multinational corporations and COVID, which includes the international intellectual property rights, which is continuing this discussion. So we're going to have to stop here. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and I'll see you again.